Hello and welcome to Inside Exercise. I'm Emeritus Professor Glenn McConell. I've just finished chatting with Professor Laurie Goodyear from the Joslin Diabetes Centre at the Harvard Medical School. She has an amazing track record in exercise metabolism. For many years, she was looking at the regulation of glucose uptake during exercise. She's also done a lot of research on fat metabolism during exercise. More recently, she's been looking at the beneficial effects of paternal and maternal exercise on offspring health. So, for example, if your father, well, these are rodent studies, but if the father exercises, then the offspring are protected from diabetes, including if the father's on a high-fat diet, also if the mother's on a high-fat diet and she exercises either before, during, or both before and during the pregnancy, the offspring are protected from developing insulin resistance and diabetes. So quite remarkable findings. So here we're talking about epigenetics. So, everyone's familiar with genetics, but this is actually epigenetics. So, what you do in your lifetime can affect what is passed on to the next generation. And indeed, we talk a little bit about her really exciting recent findings that even the grandparents, so if the grandmother exercises, again, rodents, the grandchildren are protected to some extent. So really quite remarkable. And these findings do appear to have relevance to humans. So we talk a little bit about her studies in that regard. We also talk a little bit about some of the research I've done along similar lines. So in the end, it's really quite remarkable that if the mother exercises, the father exercises, or even in some of my studies, if the offspring exercise early in life, they can overcome some of the developmental effects. So we're talking here about developmental origins of health and disease. So if you've had a poor environment either before conception, during pregnancy, or even early in life, you can, exercise can have beneficial effects. So I think you'll really enjoy this one. So stick around. Hi, Laurie. How are you? It's been a while.
It's great to see you, Glenn. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm excited. So it's been a while. Last time I saw you, I think it was like 10, 15 years ago or something crazy. I think at the American Diabetes Association conference. And we were both doing sort of AMPK and glucose uptake and things. And now, strangely enough, we both ended up sort of moving on and, amongst other things, looking at this thing we'll be focusing on today, which is the parental effects on offspring health. So your mother and or your father, what they do with exercise can affect the offspring. Yeah.
Right.
All right. So you're at Harvard, and why don't you just explain a little bit where you are and how you actually ended up doing exercise metabolism research? Because quite a few of the people that come on here, that they were like athletes, and then they thought they wanted to study it. Other people were scientists, and then got interested in exercise. How did you end up doing what you're doing?
Well, when I was an undergraduate at Springfield College, I really didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I thought maybe some sort of management, but I took an exercise physiology class and absolutely loved it, thought it was so fascinating. And that summer, I actually had an internship, and I lived with a family outside of Boston. I was an intern for the New England Patriots, the football team, and the family that I stayed with, they had a son who had type 1 diabetes, and we would go out for runs. And this was so long ago that he was actually testing his urine with strips to look at his glucoses. And it was just so amazing to see how much of an effect exercise had on blood sugar levels. And this guy who was basically a 20-year-old, otherwise healthy guy who had type 1 diabetes. And it really piqued my interest, having just taken exercise physiology. And I really wanted to understand, how did this happen? How is it that exercise can be so beneficial for people with diabetes? And then, of course, also thinking about people with type 2 diabetes. So that led me then in my senior year in college to look into graduate programs in exercise physiology. I ended up at the University of South Carolina for a master's degree. It was a fantastic experience. I had great advisors. And it was really, I learned so much. And then I took a couple years. It was a pretty intense program, so I took a couple years off, and I went and did exercise physiology research at the Nike Sport Research Lab at the time, which was in Exeter, New Hampshire. That was also a really very interesting experience that I really enjoyed. Learned some things about running and muscle damage that occurs with running. Did some work in collaboration with people at University of Massachusetts in Amherst. But this whole time really had the idea from the time I started exercise physiology research that I really wanted to understand basic science and basic mechanisms of what happens. So I went to the University of Vermont to work with Ed Horton, who was studying exercise and diabetes. He was actually, it was the chair of medicine at University of Vermont, and had this great research program going on studying glucose metabolism and exercise. And our lab was one of the first to show GLUT4 translocation with insulin and with exercise in skeletal muscle. And that just, then my career just went from there. Ended up doing a postdoc at the Joslin Diabetes Centre, Harvard, with a Harvard appointment as a fellow, and then just thought I was going to be here in Boston for 2 years, and now I've been here my entire career. So that's kind of a long story, but it really is pretty amazing that I got interested in something when I was an undergraduate, and I've actually stayed with it and continued my career in what I started out to do, which I know most people, that doesn't happen. I tell my kids all the time, you don't end up necessarily where you think you're going, but, and I probably never thought that I would end up, having this research career all these years, but it's been fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting because I heard, especially in America, that apparently people go through like 5 different careers or something. And I think
yes, quite often, yeah.
I'm a bit conservative or something. I haven't done that. That's interesting. Well, it's a good thing you took that exercise class. And it's also interesting because I didn't realize you'd gone through that sort of applied, because, for me, for example, I was a runner, and then I was interested in that, and then I got into the science. But you sort of didn't start off that way, but you kind of went applied, and then you became mechanistic. So that's interesting.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, that's great background there with GLUT4. So people would know, I think, GLUT4 is, we've talked about anyway, if they've seen many of these podcasts, is a glucose transporter, which is involved in like moving glucose into the muscle, for example, which we're particularly interested in. So that was how I got to know your work mainly. We were both looking at regulation of glucose uptake, role of AMP kinase. I think I'm going to do something on that coming up at some stage. I have to do something on that. But so all sorts of amazing stuff with glucose metabolism. But now I guess it's fair to say you're doing a lot with sort of developmental origins of health and disease, but still an interest in glucose metabolism. Yes. So why don't you just give us a bit of a background on this DOHAD, developmental origins of health and disease, how we even sort of started thinking about that, and then it's ended up with this sort of studies you're doing nowadays.
So it was quite a while ago. I don't know exactly when, but we started hearing in seminars. Joslin has an unbelievable seminar series program where we bring in people from all over, leading experts in all aspects of diabetes. And there were lectures really talking about this awareness that the influence that the mothers, particularly initially, could have on the offspring in terms of their metabolic health. Mary Elizabeth Patty, who is at Joslin and was at Joslin at the time, was doing work on intrauterine restriction, and we got involved with some of that. But I think that the striking fact that really kept playing in my head is that there was more and more data that either nutrition in terms of undernutrition or overnutrition seemed to result in these problems, metabolic problems in the offspring, either with animal models and in some cases in human studies. So the so-called Dutch famine studies, where during World War II, and there was a blockade, and in the Netherlands, and there were women that were pregnant, and they were rationed very, very low calories. And what has been discovered in some really important papers is that the children and even the grandchildren of these women that were food deprived and really starved during this time period ended up having increased rates of obesity, metabolic disease, cardiometabolic disease. So this happens with undernutrition. There was also evidence that this could be happening with overnutrition as the world is becoming more obese. We're seeing this cycle of the parents are obese or the mother's obese during pregnancy, leading to obese children. So we really started to think about, well, if there's, such terrible consequences of obesity, perhaps there could be beneficial consequences of the mother being active. And so we would have loved to have started these studies in humans, but they would take 30, 40, 50, 60 years to do. And so we went to animal models and we started to do studies where we would have women, not women, have mice, female mice that were pregnant, exercising, doing voluntary wheel running, so putting them in a cage where they could run as much as they want, but also at the same time do another set of female mice that were treated with a high-fat diet to mimic the effects of obesity, and then to see what would happen to the offspring once if they exercised while they were pregnant. So that's kind of how it really came from listening, thinking about what's happening in humans, and then thinking, okay, can we reverse this? Is there a means to reverse this? And then going to the animal models to try to understand what the metabolic consequences to the children would be, the offspring of the mice.
Yeah, it's quite amazing actually how several of us have ended up looking at this area. So and all of us started off looking at regulation of glucose uptake. So I had Jorgen Wojciechowski, who I know, he did a postdoc with you, right?
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was on last week talking about insulin action and exercise, and so I started doing some stuff with the as you said, the interuterine growth restriction. And the next thing I saw, Jorgen was doing some stuff with born small and exercise, and then I saw you were doing stuff, and it's like, holy mackerel! But yeah, it's pretty interesting. So the stuff we did was in rats as well, because as you say, it means you can study because rats only live like 2 years, I think. If maybe it's slightly
a little
longer.
It depends. Yeah,
They don't usually. Yes, obviously it's not always a happy ending with the studies we do, so they don't usually live as long as that. But it means you can study them over, So for example, you can look at them, their offspring at like six months of age. They wean at like 9 weeks and things like that. Yeah. So why don't we touch on the fact that this thing, controversy over many years about evolution. And then there was someone called Lamarck a long time ago that was saying, for example, the classic thing, which is if a giraffe is, why do giraffes end up with long necks? And, obviously Darwinian evolution is that the ones with longer necks mated with other ones with longer necks because they had a better chance to reach the top of the tree or whatever. And then the necks ended up longer. Lamarck was sort of saying because they're stretching their necks, they would pass that on. I know it's very simplistic. Why don't we just talk about that and introduce some of these terms, and then we'll talk about specifics of what you found. Do you mind just fleshing that out slightly without, getting into but just maybe Lamarck was kind of half right and whatever. Yeah.
Oh, in terms of
in terms of what we're looking at here, and the term epigenetics. If we start thinking about the fact you can pass on your genes, but you can also pass on markers. Yeah.
So well, I should say that once we did the initial studies, and we found that if the moms exercised both at a period of before the pregnancy and during the pregnancy, when we studied the offspring, there were tremendous beneficial effects of the mother's exercising, and this was keeping the offspring controlled. So the offspring did not have access to wheel cages. They were not doing spontaneous exercise. They were not eating more. Even their body weights really weren't changing when they were young. They weren't any different. So just by virtue of the mother exercising, something was being passed on to these offspring. And these were siblings. Well, the mothers were siblings, so there really weren't big differences there should not be difference in the genetic makeup of these females. So it really suggests that something was happening beyond genes, or what's often referred to as epigenetics. And epigenetics being modifications, not of the DNA sequence, but in the way the DNA is really regulated. So you can have methylation of the DNA at specific promoters of genes that are very important, and that there can be regulation or methylation of these promoter areas of these genes, and this can be altered in the animal, in the fetus. And this can be changed and then have effects as they get older, because then the levels of gene expression can change, and then changes in protein can occur also. So this is this so-called epigenetic regulation. It's not just methylation, but also you can have changes in histones, which are what keeps the DNA together in a sense and allows the DNA to open up so it can be turned into messenger RNA and then onto protein. So histones are important. So methylation is important in histones. And also microRNAs are important because they can regulate the DNA. So it's really epigenetics are regulating the DNA without actually changing the base pairs. And so we have studied the effects of the maternal exercise on epigenetic regulation. We think that it's not just about the genetic component. Obviously, the genetic component is extremely important, but it's also this epigenetics that is regulating what's happening to the offspring.
Exactly. So before epigenetics was discussed and now is pretty much accepted, one would think whatever they did in their life didn't make any difference. So I remember we used to talk about why is it that if you've got two athletes, they tend to sometimes have an offspring that's good. And you say, well, it's because they've got good genes, and you don't tend to think about anything they did. So you tend to think, well, it wouldn't have mattered if they were runners or not during their life. They had those good genes, and they passed it on to the offspring. They passed them on to the offspring. It didn't make any difference what they did during their life. But now we know what you do during your life. So you've touched on I think you said already, high-fat diets or obese parents affects the offspring. So now we know what you do during your life makes a difference. So those genes didn't change. If they were obese or not obese, their genes didn't change. But because they were obese, they affected these epigenetic markers. So basically, you sort of change these things. Sometimes the epigenetics is kind of above the genes. So it's kind of like the little markers that are on the genes, they get passed on. Is that a fair way of summarizing?
Yeah. It's what these marks get passed on to the offspring, and then can affect them, potentially through the rest of their lives of the offspring.
Yeah, so Lamarck, I know it's controversial, but if Lamarck was still around, he'd be saying, well, it was because, partly because they were stretching their necks, that it got passed on. But so why don't we talk a little bit about what you've done? So you've done obese or high fat feeding. I want to separate that out a bit later and say how much is the high fat feeding and how much is the obesity. But so obese mums, obese dads, you've exercised the dads, you've exercised the mums, and you've got to the offspring. So why don't you take us through that? Maybe, I don't know, mums first, and then, because mums, people can sort of get that, that you've got a pregnant mum, and if she runs on the treadmill or whatever she does, you can imagine that having a benefit. The weird thing is to think about the dad, especially as if your studies were like mine, we had the conception and then the dad was gone. He was no longer in the picture, but it still had the effects on the offspring.
So with the experiments with the moms, we looked at the different timing of exercise in our first study. So we took some females and we exercised them. And again, we didn't exercise them. They did voluntary exercise. So they exercise as much as they want. So this is less, it's not stressful for the animal. And so we had a group that was in cages that didn't have wheels and animals that were in cages that did have wheels. And the moms either exercised for 2 weeks before the pregnancy. And then once they got pregnant, they didn't exercise anymore. Because their cages didn't have wheels, or they exercised for the 2 weeks before they became pregnant, and they stayed in those cages with the wheels during this. It's about a 3-week gestation for mice. And then we had a group that only were put in the cages with the wheels after they were pregnant. So you had a group that exercised before pregnancy, just during the pregnancy, and then a group that exercised both before and during the pregnancy. It's pretty amazing how much they exercise. Mice exercise when given a wheel. They do a huge amount of exercise. We see anywhere from 6 to 10 kilometers a day in animals, and females are the same before they're pregnant. Once they become pregnant, they continue to exercise, but the curve kind of comes down. But still, even in the 3rd trimester, which is the last week of a mouse pregnancy, they're still doing about 2 kilometers a day. So they're getting exercised, and they're, exercise responses and things. So they have, if you look at the muscles of the pregnant females that have exercised, you'll see adaptations to the muscle that you would see in an animal that wasn't pregnant. And then the females are, they give birth, and then we study these offspring anywhere from about 4 weeks of age when mice wean out into a year, and we've even studied some animals out even later than that. So a year is about middle age in a mouse. And what we find is that if the mom exercises, you see that, well, first I should say, if the mom doesn't exercise, both male and female offspring, as they get older, their glucose tolerance gets worse. So they become more insulin resistant, they get more glucose tolerant. But if the mom exercised, this aging effect of glucose tolerance getting worse is almost completely gone. The levels are look like a younger animal. The glucose levels are lower, they look like a younger animal. Same thing with insulin concentrations, which we know are so important. The lower the insulin concentrations, the better. And these are much lower than mom exercise. Now, we had another group of animals that were fed a high-fat diet, and they become somewhat obese. It's not a really long-term high-fat feeding that is done. It's only for the 2 weeks and throughout the gestation. So this high-fat feeding is done, but again, the moms are exercising in one group, and the other group is sedentary. So in the sedentary group, the moms that ate the high-fat diet, their offspring, it's really remarkable how much worse their glucose tolerance is. Again, just by virtue of the mom eating that high-fat diet. And insulin levels are higher. It's just bad news for these mice offspring if their moms ate a high-fat diet. But if the moms exercised, had that access to the wheel before and during the exercise, the offspring are completely normal. Completely normal. They have no bad effects of the mom. And I should say, all the offspring, they eat the same diet, just a regular diet. They don't have access to any exercise. Their body weights, at least at the younger ages, are the same. So it's really due to the mom having exercise before and during the pregnancy. Not much of, like I said, not much of an effect if the mom's exercise just before or just during the pregnancy, but they really see the best effect if the mom's exercise both before and during the pregnancy. So it's really, we were just astounded by these data. What was really interesting, I think, is that we don't see these effects when the animals are younger so much. We only see them when they get older. I should have mentioned that earlier. So it's kind of like with humans, right? I mean, most kids don't end up with diabetes or high blood sugar. I mean, we know this is happening more and more as kids are becoming more sedentary and more obese. So same thing with the mice. They don't really start to have much of a problem until they get older. But as soon as those glucose homeostasis starts to get bad, glucose metabolism gets bad. That's when if the mom exercises, that really kicks in to keep the offspring healthier.
Now that's really interesting on many levels, and I've got lots of thoughts. The first one is, I guess, with the earlier stuff I was talking about, just with the high-fat diet, and the obesity, how you could, have beneficial effects of the exercise. But one thing I wanted to pick up on is you said even the control animals that weren't on a high-fat diet, their offspring became insulin resistant, etc. later in life.
Yeah,
which is what happens in humans as well, in general. And I guess especially if they're sedentary. But then you were able to prevent that by the mother's exercising, or slow it as well.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. So but then if you've got, I guess, with the obese parents, you've just shifted everything, so it's worse and it happens earlier, I guess. And the exercise is preventive, prevents this as well. Wow. And they actually normalized. So you're saying if the mum does exercise,
if the mom ate the high fat diet and exercise, the offspring will look normal throughout the first year of life anyway. So then we went on and we really wanted to understand the mechanism, and to make several years worth of work very short, what we discover are there's huge changes in the placenta, and the placenta secretes factors, and one in particular that we don't call it, but is known as superoxide dismutase 3, or SOD3. And SOD3 is coming out of the placenta, not coming out, but is going to it shows up in the maternal blood, and it also shows up in the fetal blood, and it's having dramatic effects on the liver. And the liver is one of the major regulators of glucose control. So this placental protein acts on the liver of the fetus. The liver is much healthier in the fetus and throughout at least the first year of life. And so we think this SOD3 protein is absolutely key in this. The other really interesting observation that we made and that we're studying in great detail now is that you need the mother to also have a normal vitamin D diet in order for this effect to happen. And we discovered that because we wanted to see what is the transcription factor, or what's the factor that's causing this SOD3 protein to increase. Because if we can figure that out, then we can try to translate this to humans, right? And we can make more SOD3. So what do we need? And what we found is the vitamin D receptors is essential for this effect, for the maternal exercise to increase SOD3. So then we did the studies. Well, can we just mimic then the effects of exercise by treating with vitamin D, right? Because again, translationally, we think, well, if mothers are on bed rest, can we just give them vitamin D and we can get these benefits of exercise? So we did those studies. And what we found is that you definitely need vitamin D to have the effects. So if you take out the vitamin D out of the mouse's diet, the exercise effect is gone. But unfortunately, if you just treat with high levels of vitamin D, you don't mimic the effects of exercise. So you have to have vitamin D, but it can't fully replace the effects of exercise. So you really need vitamin D and exercise in order to have these beneficial effects on the offspring. So what we've done in the meantime is we've done some human studies where we've looked at the SOD3 protein. We've looked at it in mothers who are very active versus mothers who do virtually no exercise during their pregnancy. And sure enough, the mothers that do this high level of activity have higher levels of SOD3 in their placenta and higher levels of SOD3 in their blood. And so we think that what's happening in the mice is probably also happening in the women. So we're trying to do more studies now. We're trying to understand how vitamin D in women may affect this. We're thinking about, okay, women who are pregnant during the winter versus, pregnant, in the sunshine when they're getting vitamin D. So it's kind of opens. So the people who study vitamin D are very interested in this work now too, right? Because it could have really important implications for women and having healthy pregnancies and having healthy offspring.
That's really interesting.
That's a lot of the maternal work that we're doing.
how did you actually get on to so SOD3 is superoxide dismutase? So are we talking about free radicals? So a lot of people would know about free radicals or would have heard of them. Are being produced, I guess, and SOD3 is mopping that up. Is that the idea? And then you have more SOD3, or?
Yeah, so actually SOD3, back to AMP kinase, right?
Okay.
SOD3 activates AMP kinase, and that's what we found. There had been one study. Well, we did mass spectrometry to identify serum factors that might be regulating this process going on in the liver, this epigenetic process. So, and so we were looking for serum factors, and we took serum from pregnant females and sedentary females, and we also took we took serum from females that were pregnant and also trained. And compare that with serum from sedentary females. And we found all these different proteins that were different between the sedentary and the trained. And then we narrowed it down for virtual aspects of what we had seen. But then the final thing was, does this factor activate AMP kinase? Because we had already shown that AMP kinase was important in this epigenetic effect. Anyway, long story short, we found this SOD3 protein. It's known to act, it had been shown in another cell type to activate AMPK. The mechanism by which it happens, we don't really know. We think that SOD3 does probably have some antioxidant effects, but we can't just treat these animals with an antioxidant and get the same effect on SOD3. So it's a pretty complicated system, right? You have SOD3 going up, you have vitamin D you need, and then you activate this entire signaling cascade that regulates the methylation and the epigenetic regulation that then leads to the improvement in glucose tolerance. And we figured this all out using knockout animals, placental specific knockout animals. So the bottom line is you need the exercise. You need the placenta to make SOD3. You need adequate vitamin D, and then you need these effects on the liver. And all those things together, as you know, the body is very complicated, but all those things together then make the offspring healthy as they're aging.
That's interesting. Now, just to maybe prevent people racing out and getting vitamin D, I noticed a couple of times you said point, normal vitamin D. Yeah, so you need
to have normal levels of vitamin D. So if you're completely deficient in vitamin D, then the benefits of exercise are probably not going to be there for the offspring. Again, these are based on animal studies. We're trying to study this now in humans too. But you can't take mega doses of vitamin D, which is basically what we did with the mice. We gave them mega doses. gave them high doses of vitamin D to see if that could mimic the effects of the maternal exercise, and it couldn't. There was some additivity in the effect. So if you had exercise and high vitamin D, it was a little bit better, but it was not, you couldn't just it didn't result in mimicking the effects of the exercise.
Okay. Now this one, when you're talking about the mother exercising and affecting the offspring, and it's something that's actually happening while she's pregnant, that's kind of easier to get your head around than the dad. So again, I'm not quite sure what you did with your studies. You can tell us, but the ones we did, we had the father on a high-fat diet, and then they literally conceived, and then the next day he was gone. We literally, he died, unfortunately. So then it's kind of a bit harder to think about what's going on. That then, for example, we found, and I think you found as well, that if you then exercise the mother, you can fix something that happened from the father. Do you want to just flesh that out a little bit? What you think's going on there?
Yeah. So we did studies initially just with the dads exercising, and we found very clear effects of the dad exercising on the offspring. The data looked very similar to when the moms exercise. And again, these are done prior to the breeding. So the animals would do voluntary wheel running for about 3 weeks, and then they would breed with the females, and then the females weren't treated, the offspring weren't treated, but still, by virtue of the dad exercising, the offspring were much healthier. And it also, again, had beneficial effects, even despite the animals where the dads were eating high-fat diets. So it was pretty remarkable. So we have done studies analyzing the sperm, and we do see some changes in the sperm. We see changes in motility of the sperm. We're also doing work on looking at small non-coding RNAs, and we see changes there. And we're doing more work on this now to really try to understand what the mechanism is to how these how this is passed on to the offspring, and very important work also to try to understand how it is that males are able to do this. And there are studies going on at Joslin now. Mary Elizabeth Patty is doing some of this work where they're looking at the dads and what changes in or not the dads, but in a male, what happens when they exercise, what happens when they eat, have poor diets, or and what happens to the sperm. What's the molecular regulation of the sperm that may then be affecting the offspring in the future?
So it's pretty interesting there. You'd have to think there's very different mechanisms. So with the mother you were talking about, the placenta. Obviously, with the father, it's not. But you ended up with quite similar.
Very similar metabolic. Yeah. So we need to do more work on this. We need to understand it better. With the maternal exercise, we don't see much of an effect in the offspring on their skeletal muscle. We think it's largely in the liver. In the males, we think that it looks like there's some effects on the muscle of the offspring. So it probably is a different mechanism. We've also done the studies where we've combined. We've had 4 groups: the dad's exercise, the mom exercise, and both the mom and dad's exercise, and then the sedentary animals. We wanted to see if there was an additive effect. There does tend to be a bit of an additive effect if both parents exercise. We did those studies under high-fat feeding conditions. We didn't do it under the chow, just because 8 groups.
So many groups.
So many groups. And one of the things that people that do research, the difference here is that every pup that is born is not an N of 1. It's the entire litter that you study is the N. So typically, in order, if you want to have a group of 8, you need at least 4. That's really 32 that you're studying. So you can imagine if you have 8 groups, and you're talking about thousands of animals.
It becomes tricky as well that you ideally want to have like 8 offspring from each litter, and then you have 1 in each group and whatever, but that doesn't always work out, especially you mentioned you did a bit, but we did the uterine growth restriction. So you reduce the blood flow to the uterus, and then you actually end up, you don't have as many offspring. So then it's really hard to separate them out.
Very well, So can I just, one other point that I should have made when we were talking about the maternal exercises, we've also done studies of grand-maternal exercise. So when the grandmothers exercise, and these data are really, really remarkable also. And we find that with the mice, if what ends up being the grandmothers, if they exercise before and during the pregnancy, and then we take what we call the F1 or the first generation, we take the males, and then when they're only 8 weeks of age, before they have any effect of the mothers having on their glucose tolerance, because that comes later. But if you breed those males at 8 weeks to just sedentary females, the offspring or the grand offspring have improved glucose tolerance.
Yes.
So it's not just the moms having an effect, but if the grandmas exercise, the grandmothers exercise, the offspring are much more healthy. So we published this past year, and it's gotten some attention in the press because, what your grandmother did.
That was the
affect you.
That was the one that actually, I had you on my list already. But when I saw that paper, that was quite recent, the grandmother.
Yeah.
When I saw that, it's like, okay, we've got to get you on. That's pretty awesome. What about if you go the other way? So you got the grandmother exercising, and then how many you can't look at everything in its big studies, but do you know how many generations it lasts for? So if you exercise.
No, we haven't gone beyond the second generation. It takes years to do those studies because we wait. We don't study animals when they're young, right? We study animals when they're a year old. That's when we study them. So in all the breeding and the multiple generations. And then if you think about it, if you do the math, right? Because again, the N is not the number of pups you're studying, it's the grandmother is the N. And you think about multiple generations and how many animals you're actually studying. So we have to always do these studies by cohort. So there's multiple cohorts. And yeah, it's if you look at the math, like I said, if you look at the math, it's pretty remarkable.
What about the dad? You haven't done it. You can't do everything again, but
we haven't done
the grandfather.
Second generation. Yeah. All these studies are, they take a while. Certainly they don't take as long as if you were doing these studies in humans.
Of course,
many decades, right? And, the studies take a while in it. And there are many mice that are studied in these experiments.
So one thing I wanted to get back to is you made the point a couple of times about how it was wheel running. Yeah. So, this is where you put a running wheel in the cage, and they choose to run. Now, even the ones that are on a high fat diet, they don't run as much. Yeah. So does that make it hard to compare? Sorry, when they're obese, it would be harder for them to run.
Well,
I guess.
at this, we don't have I don't think we really saw differences in wheel running. If it was very mild. Sometimes you see fewer pups born to moms that eat a high fat diet, but the wheel running, at least because we don't study animals after 10 or 15 weeks on a high fat diet, because we're studying mice that have only been on the high fat diet for a few weeks. So they're not grossly obese.
I guess I was wondering that humans don't, we explain why it's a good idea. Well, you really need to look at rodent studies for these studies because it takes years and years and years. But obese humans don't tend to want to go out and run, right? So these are voluntary. You're not putting on a treadmill. They're choosing to run. Unfortunately, humans don't tend to act like that. For a start, they don't tend to choose to run. Now that we're not hunter-gatherers. And then the obese ones are probably even less likely to, unfortunately. Yeah. There's no question there. It's just a comment, I guess. So what do you do about, so if we think about putting this into practice, so we've got some obese people, should we be telling them to lose weight before they conceive, or it's unlikely to happen, try and get them to exercise?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the recommendations, really. If your obstetrician is telling you, you want to get pregnant, whether you're the male or the female, the advice is to be as lean as you can. I mean, if you're obese, to eat a healthy diet, and to be physically active. So I think there's really strong evidence to suggest that that's very important. And by doing some of these animal studies, we're really trying to we're starting to learn why that is, what's the mechanisms, and are there things that we can do to help women and men in terms of passing on good epigenetic regulation for their offspring, so they'll have a healthy lifestyle.
So I guess I'm wondering if that does really happen. So in an ideal world, I'm sure, medical doctors would be saying, try and lose some weight and exercise before you get pregnant. But does that really high in the list of things they think about, do you think? I know if you've got polycystic ovarian syndrome, that's just critical to increase fertility.
Yeah, probably most men and women don't go to the doctor beforehand and say, okay, I want to get pregnant in a year. What should I be doing over the next year? Most people end up there after they become pregnant. Exactly. Right? And at that point, it's eat a healthy diet, don't smoke, be as physically active as you can, don't drink alcohol. Another
one of the wheel running ones is I've thought about a bit, because I've done that as well, is I wonder if they partly, because it's obviously a lot less stressful than putting on them a treadmill and making them run, which is what tends to happen. But I wonder if they partly run so much because they're bored. They're in this cage, nothing else to do. I know there are other studies that they showed if you put it in nature, you put running wheels out in the middle of the country.
They do a lot of running, so they do like it, I think.
I even saw a slug got on there, and it was like doing about 1 millimeter an hour or something. Yeah. So I guess they haven't got much else to do. But yeah, it's really, we have to emphasize again, they're running like 6 to 10 kilometers a day, and these mice are like tiny. So it's kind of like us running 2 marathons a day.
But it is very hard to know how to translate the amount that the mice are doing to what a human would need to do in order to have these effects. But I can say that, if we look at SOD3 as a marker, this, placental protein that I talked about before, that we know is so important in the health effects on the mice, that the increases in SOD3 that are present in women that exercise are comparable to what's happening in the mice, and they're not doing anywhere near that amount of exercise. The women, the group of women that we were studying that had the increased levels were doing about 40 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity exercise a day. So
the other thing, I guess, is the way to look at it is that's their normal activity. So it's kind of like they normally run 8 kilometers a day. So a human doing their normal activity might be that similar comparison. One study we did at one stage was we said, okay, instead of having what most people do, which you have a cage with no running wheel and they don't do any running at all, and then they do training, which might be the running wheel or treadmill. We actually said, okay, if you want to look at the effect of training, you almost have to have the running wheel as their normal activity, and then you add a treadmill to that to do the exercise training. Have you ever thought about that? Because it kind of does your head in a way, but if you think it through, you go, hang on a minute, 99.9% of studies ever done have been in a cage with no running wheels. So that's so unphysiologically sedentary that what does it even mean,
Well, a lot of people, and I think this too, the treatment really isn't the exercise. The treatment is the sedentary, because normally a mouse is active, and like you said, these out in the wild wheel cages are utilized. They want to do this, they want to be active. So the treatment is really more the lack of activity. That's what's not normal. So I think that's another way to look at this research on exercise that so many of us now do, that we're really studying what the body is supposed to be doing, and the normal physiology of how, you're talking about hunter-gatherers, that's where we came from. And so this is the sedentary behavior, I think, is more the treatment in a sense, if you think about it in terms of studies.
Exactly. So maybe what it is, instead of people listening at home now thinking they've got to go out and, run 10 Ks a day or something to try and match the mouse, at least, they should be thinking if they're just normally active and walking and trying to do it throughout the day or whatever, maybe that would be enough protection. What did you actually do in the humans? Do you exercise the woman? Yes.
So these are collaborative studies that we did. And so we haven't done any training studies. These are collaborative studies we've done with groups from Canada, University of Ottawa, Christy Adamo, and we've also done some work with Niels Janssen and some others in Denmark. And these are ongoing studies that they have where they're using accelerometers and just monitoring the amount of exercise among large groups of women, and then taking the women that exercise the most and comparing them with the women that sort of exercise the least.
Perfect. So, now, one other thing I thought about with the studies we did was, if you've got the parents on a high-fat diet, right, and then you mentioned that the offspring are on a normal diet, that's something I thought about at one stage, that switching of diets might be a bit different to what would happen in normal life. So, you imagine if you're in a family they're not eating well or whatever, and then that's what you're seeing in utero. Yeah. And then suddenly when you're born, they starting a healthy diet, you know what I mean? Yeah. Which could actually happen, which.
Yeah, but with the mice, I think that it's sort of a weaning thing too, right? Because they continue to, they're feeding from their mothers that are continuing on the high fat diet, so they are getting that. And I guess
Oh, they
it's
are continue.
when they
Okay.
go off, yeah, when they're weaned, then they go on the the rodent chow.
That's
Um,
true.
yeah.
All right. What I'm going to do now is do a bit of a switch. You have someone like Laurie Goodyear on with, I don't know, 250 papers or something and 45,000 citations and all these awesome things. You think everything she does works. Is that right? Every study you've ever done works? Is that right?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Every
Everyone published
one.
every single
Fantastic.
data that we
Yeah, yeah. Wow, I've been unlucky and you've been really lucky. Yeah.
um, no, that's not the way science works at all. There's a lot of, I mean, there's technical failure where experiments don't work. You can just, it's not that the data sometimes the data just doesn't get generated. And it's a lot of experimental, um, there's not a cookbook for everything that's done in science, right? We're constantly developing new methods and new procedures, and that is by trial and error to try to get experiments. So if you're studying cells, for example, are they going to survive? If they don't survive, then obviously you can't ask your scientific question. So developing imaging technologies, not that we're really doing that, but there's just doing biochemical experiments to study how cells signal within the cell, and how do they transmit, how does one molecule tell another molecule what to do. So there's a lot of time and energy that goes into experimental development, and a lot of those experiments don't work the first time. It's rare that something works the first time, and it can be, so it can be frustrating, and it can delay people's research, and certainly we have that. A lot of times you have what you think is the best hypothesis ever, but it's not. It doesn't work that way, and so sometimes that can be very frustrating. And a lot of times I'll hear students or others say, well, we hope that this would happen. And I always say, no, that's not what a scientist does. The scientist doesn't hope something's going to happen, right? The scientist wants the results to be what the results are. And so, but a lot of times experiments don't go, they seem like they're dead ends, but with a lot of perseverance and hard work, then usually we can find out the answers to the questions that we're looking at. And it always is a surprise, because lots of times it leads us in unexpected directions. We learn new things.
Exactly.
We make new discoveries.
So it's important not to just think, I thought this was going to happen, it didn't happen, so move on. Sometimes what you find, you say, okay, well, let's run with that. What is going on? Yeah. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask is something I've thought about is with our studies as well, is how much of the effect do you think with the placenta or, the sperm or whatever is the actual high fat diet, and how much is the obesity and everything that goes along with that? Do you know? Have you been able to tease that out at all?
We haven't really been able to do that. It hasn't been one of our big focuses, because we're focusing more on the exercise. I think it's a really important question, but I think because we do fairly short-term high-fat diets, there's not a huge amount of obesity in the mothers or the fathers, and you really need to do animals. You need to feed mice from a very young age the high-fat diet, and then maybe look at them a little bit later when they're really obese. We haven't also used any of the obesity models for our studies. Those are all things that I think would be interesting and important to do, but we haven't.
Okay, so you did mention that earlier. So in a way, by doing the short-term high-fat feeding, you're kind of covering that question a bit anyway. So it's not like a massive obesity situation, I guess.
Not.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking about with there's obviously pros and cons of doing animal studies versus human studies, and is it applicable? And you said some of your findings sound like they are with the SOD3 and things. One of the good things about doing animal studies is you haven't got those sociological factors, the that the offspring is being affected by, you know, the sociological factors of the parents, the fact that what they eat, whether they exercise or not, you know what I mean, role modeling or whatever. You are able to sort of separate that out and say how much of the effect is ... Yeah, is that a fair comment? It's not really a question. Yeah. So
I think that's...
yeah. So I've kind of vaguely talked about my stuff a bit, but I wouldn't mind, just because it's still developmental origins of health and disease. So I don't know if you saw, we actually did stuff where the offspring were born small for gestational age, and we showed that they became glucose intolerant. They weren't really diabetic later in life, but their glucose metabolism wasn't great. And we actually found if you actually just exercise them for 4 weeks early in life, so from when they weaned, and so basically from 5 weeks of age to 9 weeks of age, we exercised them. And even that was able to have effects later in life. So their glucose metabolism was better. So, you know, it's kind of crazy in a way, because, you know, you exercising the father, exercising the mother, us exercising the offspring, it just seems like exercise, no matter when you do it, it's able to benefit the glucose metabolism pathways.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. It is a very powerful stimulus with beneficial effects. I mean, it's the mothers, it's the grandmothers, it's the fathers, it's a young age, older age. There's very little downside to exercising at
definitely not
any age. Yeah.
The other thing I was just thinking, I guess, is you know, in a way, it's almost a good way of studying. You know how it's like debatable sometimes, like when you get insulin resistant, is it the liver that goes first, or is it the you know, is it the pancreas not secreting enough insulin, or is it the muscle? In a way, you kind of get a bit of an angle on that, because you were saying with the mother, it seems like it's like the liver, and then with the father, it might be a bit of muscle, and then with us, with the early exercise, it was more the pancreas. You know, it was the beta cell mass which produces the insulin. That was the thing that was reduced by 50% when they were born small. If you exercise them early in life, they had normal beta cell mass later. So it's kind of interesting. It's, in a way, I don't know if I'm, you know, extrapolating too much, but in a way, it's sort of showing that it doesn't matter actually what goes first, you know, because we're so integrated.
Right.
Probably everything else follows. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, certainly I work on a diabetes institute, so not so much now, but it used to be everybody's, you know, had their favorite organ that was, you know, in charge and responsible for type 2 diabetes. But everything, all the, I think the liver is important, you know, the muscle is important, the adipose tissue is important, the brown fat, the brain controlling things is important, and certainly the pancreas is important. So I think that it's a lot of very many tissues are involved in the regulation of glucose homeostasis. And what we're finding is that exercise seems to have effects on all these tissues, which may be, you know, we found that with the maternal exercise that there were huge effects on the fetal liver. But now what we're studying many other tissues too, to understand whether the maternal exercise also affects, you know, the adipose, the kidney, the brain, you know, what are the other tissues? So I think that you're right. It's just all the different tissues are involved in terms of the consequences of diabetes and also the effects of exercise.
The other thing, I guess, was becoming more and more apparent is how the crosstalk between organs, that now they're all talking to each other. So that, you know, it's kind of easy to think the muscle might be talking to the liver and the fat and whatever, but it's even going the other way. Because you think, you know, when you're exercising, the muscle's contracting, and fair enough, something might be being released. But
well, the other big line of research, major line of research in my laboratory right now is studying the adipose tissue and how the adipose tissue, and this is independent of pregnancy, but how the adipose tissue is dramatically changing with exercise and exercise training, and how the adipose tissue is talking to other tissues in the body, and all the adaptations that are occurring in the different in white adipose tissue, brown adipose tissue, the different white adipose tissue depots. So that, I think it's a extremely important area of understanding the benefits of
So
exercise.
this is so people that don't know, adipose is fat cells. Yes. So that's actually interesting. And it made me think, because Barbara Kahn, she's in Boston as well. She had that classic study where they had, so you mentioned knockout before. So knocking out is where you literally like get a mouse and you can genetically modify it. So you like knock out one of the genes and then you can see what effect that has. I know she had the classic study where she knocked out the glucose transporter GLUT4 in muscle, and it didn't have much effect on insulin sensitivity. But when she knocked it out in the fat, it had a greater effect. Is that right? Or have I mixed that up?
It had good effects. Yeah.
Yeah. So the fats. So you're not doing exercise, but we know that even with exercise, you've got adipokines. So proteins released from fat, which are released during exercise.
Yeah, that's what we've been studying. That we've discovered some exercise-induced adipokines that are affecting other tissues. Okay. And what we're also finding is that when you exercise, lactate increases, and that lactate is actually signaling the adipose tissue to generate adipokines and having adaptations. So it's all the muscle talks to fat. The fat then secretes proteins that are affecting others. So real true inter-tissue communications with exercise.
That's awesome. It's amazing. Lactate just keeps coming up, and I've asked George Brooks to come on several times. I guess all I can do. So this guy, George Brooks, has been talking about lactate forever, and now we know it's affecting appetite and all sorts of things. Yep. All right, this has been great. I feel like I keep looking at my notes and feeling like we've left out big chunks of things, but is there anything you think we haven't sort of covered?
No. Been very lot of information.
So I wonder if we can have if you can give us some like takeaway messages that would, if it's 3 or 4 things, or we want to take away from this chat.
Yeah. So I guess the main thing is that, I am not an obstetrician. I'm not like, I can't prescribe exercise to people or when they're pregnant or how much they should do. But certainly I think it's something important to talk to your physician about. And I think that the more active a woman can be during pregnancy, I think the better off the health of the child will be, not just when they're a child, but also into adulthood. And I think that if we can really understand how exercise works in this regard, it can really help with some of the metabolic diseases that we're seeing, these increases in metabolic disease. So I think it's an extremely important area of research. I think understanding mechanisms is so critical, because this is how we can develop treatments, either treatments by exercising, doing certain types of exercise, or even for women that say have to be on bed rest. Are there pharmacological treatments that we can develop based on what we in what we know from from the exercise studies in mice? Can we come up with treatments that can help women? So the same thing with men. I think it's very important to stay physically active, and certainly if you're planning on having a child, I think it's extremely important. But exercise throughout life is good, and now we have more reason to exercise, because it's affecting not just the person who's exercising, but their offspring, and maybe even
offspring. Wow. Okay. Actually, I can't help talking. I keep thinking, how old are your twins now? We're talking about offspring.
Offspring, yeah. Well, actually, I have 3 offspring. I have twins that are 21 now.
21.
In college. Yep.
Oh my gosh.
A son and a daughter that are twins that are 21, and then I have an 18-year-old son also. So he's starting to look at colleges, and my son and daughter are juniors in college right now. So they're doing well. One is heading in your direction,
really?
Going to Australia actually for the spring semester. So
cool.
And she's studying health and human physiological sciences. So
good.
I guess that was passed on, I think, epigenetically.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on.
All right. And, thank you very much, Glenn.
See you next time. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please like, subscribe, pass it on to your friends and colleagues. Check out the other podcasts. Thanks again.